So grateful to have you here. Leshuva Baita, to return home, by Yishai Ribo. The translation is like this: the time has come to wake up, to leave everything behind in order to overcome, to return home. Don't try to look away from this place. The time has come to break from the past and go forward into the future. Even if we missed a few stops along the way, we'll eventually catch that train back to our own neighborhoods. Everything is possible if only we want it. The seeker always finds what he is looking for, even if it's somewhere far off. The doors are never locked. When the sun calls out, "Save us," the Father in heaven will arrive. Even the Father. Even when we do something wrong, he forgives and pardons, forgives and pardons. And as we reach out our hands for help, he gives in his mercy the power to repair this world and to return to him. The Jewish understanding of tshuva, of repentance, is really based in this word leshuv, to return. In a sense, a homecoming. Coming home to our true selves, coming home to ourselves who are made in the image of God. And this is ultimately what justice is about: living truth into this world, love enacted in public. But this song is speaking to me tonight on another level too. It's speaking to me tonight in the voice of hundreds of thousands of children who this very evening are looking forward to falling asleep in beds that are not their own, missing their families and neighbors, wondering why the world is so cruel and devoid of love and understanding. We're here tonight because too many children, brothers and sisters, moms and dads, too many are sleeping in beds far away from home or wondering where their loved ones are falling asleep tonight. We're here because we must bear witness to them, and we must acknowledge our own responsibility as people of faith to them and their experiences in this system that is so addicted to incarceration that it seeks to entrap even the bodies of Black and brown children the moment they interact with the public systems. So this song that you just heard is about the hope that we must nonetheless have to dismantle this pipeline that takes children away from their homes and redesign something that funnels them back and prevents others from going in the first place. We must make some stops along the way, though, to places like research land, reflection land, listening, and then move towards redemption, repentance, and prayers for forgiveness and pardon. We'll only know that we've arrived ourselves back home when we as a society have been forgiven. We'll only know that when Black and brown students are given the opportunity to become all that God has placed within them. And then, and only then, will God return to us as well. That might be our prayer for tonight as well. Amen. I'm going to hand it over now to the incredible Miss Deirdre Reed, who I want, even before she starts to speak, to thank so much for her incredible dynamism, her passion, her brilliance, and her true prophecy when it comes to community organizing and pushing us all in the direction of redemption and repair. We're so grateful to you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Lydia. And thank you all for coming, those who are with us via Zoom, and for you all who are with us via Facebook Live. We're so appreciative of you spending this time with us as we start to really dive into what it takes to not only dismantle the school to prison pipeline, but for us to formulate a pipeline to possibilities for Black and brown children who, as Rabbi Lydia talked about, are often left behind. Last week, we talked about through our first session, the school to prison pipeline and school discipline and the role of police officers in schools. And we spent that time, I feel like it was a really good time together, just delving into like, what is that experience like for young people as they are entering schools, but find schools as a place where they're being pushed out on a constant basis. And so out of that work, we had a couple of, and this work coupled, we have a couple of things that we want to make sure that we kind of just highlight from the beginning. One is that we want to hear your school discipline and your school pipeline to possibility stories. And to do that, whether you're a parent, a teacher, or a student, or if you know a student, all you need to do is text us at EMI 797979. So you text EMI, standing for Ending Mass Incarceration, to the numbers 797979. And doing that, there's a form there where you can fill out that form with the name of the student and any kind of information about like what your story is, and we will contact you all back over the next month to try to get you engaged in storytelling with us. The second piece is that we want you to join one of the chapters that in your local region. And so you can reach the chapters at emi.odyssey forward slash, I'm sorry, not forward, dash impact.org. Just go ahead and go there. We know that everybody, as much as we, are progressive people of faith, that everybody isn't in the same place inside of your congregation or your faith institution. And so what we wanted to do was make sure that we had a watch party just to start to delve into what all this means. And there's a wonderful documentary called Push Out, which chronicles the ways in which young Black girls inside of schools are being pushed out of school through school discipline policies, a lot of which has to do with their hair, and that there's literally active legislation on the national level that is associated with this work. And so we want to watch this documentary together, have a discussion, and then take our righteous indignation and point it towards the legislators who could potentially help to get this this legislation passed. And then finally in May, what we asked you to do last week and we'll ask you to do again this week is take this information back to your faith institution. So yes, you're here to represent your faith institution, but we know you can't do this work alone. And so, joining the chapter makes all the sense in the world for an individual, but you need to make sure that your congregation or your faith institution is willing to work with you. And so we want you to go and gather some folks and meet us back in May so that we could do some deep dive workshops on like how to get policy change in your local community. So I'm going to stop there and start the framing for tonight's session. First, I just want to introduce myself again. I'm Deirdre Reed. I am a part of the steering committee representing my organization, TNTP. TNTP is a nonprofit organization that seeks to end injustices and educational inequities by providing excellent teachers to students who need them the most and advancing policies and practices that ensure effective teaching in every classroom. Next slide. We're here to help and support. And though I wear that hat, I'm also coming, I wear the hat of a partner for policy and advocacy at TNTP. I am very clear about the role and that I play in movement building as it relates to ending the school to prison pipeline. And so I want to start with just grounding this conversation in a couple of key points, because I feel like we're going to go somewhere. These panelists are amazing. And as we're going that place, if we don't start in the right direction, we might not end where we want to go. And so I want to start with our why and the values that undergird this work. And I'm only going to read one quote, and it's the quote from Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It's the first one. It says, "Education becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with the reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world." And so, yes, we're going to talk a lot about data and in statistics, but ultimately the goal of education is to prepare young people so that they can think critically about their world, and then they can figure out how to show up there. So I want to start there. Next slide. Yes. And here's what grounds us and what grounds this work. One is that our children are brilliant, that they are, when they come out of the womb, they are coming out seeking independence. They are not, they are trying to figure out how to, you know, if you've ever seen a 2-year-old, they are trying to figure out, like, they are grabbing their hands from their parents or their caregivers. They are trying to figure out how to put their own clothes on, get themselves together, and get out in the world, because they have something to prove. And something happens, you know, to many Black and brown students by second or third grade. Like, when they, like, that first time that you see them with those book bags on going into pre-K or kindergarten, they are super excited about the fact that they have chosen their own clothes, put on that book bag, and headed into that classroom. At 5, at 4, at 3, but somewhere around 8 or 9, somewhere around 7, 8, or 9, you can see that same student. And when you talk to them and you say, "What did you do today?" they're going to say nothing. Or, "How do you like school?" And they'll say, "I don't like it." And so there's something that is happening to these brilliant young people that makes them not want to participate in our education system. And so this what we really want to get to in this pipeline of possibilities series is the why. Why is that so? The second is that we know that this system is designed to be inequitable. We want to start there, that the education system it has been set up to create workers. Like, we know this, and that there's a way that conformity and nonconformity is either, you know, valued or devalued inside of this system. And so as we think about we don't want you to think about individual students and the fact that we're trying to make a better student. That happens and will happen. What we really want to concentrate this conversation on is, like, where are the places in the system of education, in the institutions of education, where there are policies and procedures that prevent our students from being the very best that they can be, and actually concretize inequities in ways that just create that pipeline to prison that Tia Martinez talked to us about last week. The next thing is that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. That is Dr. King. And Dr. King, we are in a movement building moment. So, like, the question for me and for this group and to this panel is, like, as we look at what's happening across this country and across our world, movement is happening, and education cannot not be a part of that movement. We've got to figure out how to ensure that education is a part of the movement. And then finally, charity, as it relates to people of faith, is our first line of defense when we see oppression. But it is not our only line of defense, that we have to start to think about justice and how do we move from direct service and charity, seeing it as participatory research, and moving ourselves into a place of justice seeking, which will mean that we will have to do the hard work of either supporting or denying policy, like looking at policies and procedures. I'm going to do one more slide, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Rabbi Lydia as a framing for how we get here. Oh no. Next. I'm taking too much time. Next. Maybe I'm not. I had a whole presentation. Next. But from TNTP's perspective, there's a couple of things that we know for sure, that our kids have big dreams, and that this idea that students, we have this narrative going in this country that all students aren't college or career ready, like that students, you know, all students aren't college material. And so that we should not think about creating pipelines to possibilities as getting kids ready for college, because all kids aren't college material. That is what we've heard. And what we know for sure, next slide, what we know for sure is that that's just not true. Like, a part of what we need to do throughout this time together is really to dismantle oppressive narratives that keep us from doing the hard work of looking at ourselves and saying, what do we need to change? So TNTP did some research, and what we found was that 94% of all students and 95% of Black and Latinx students, 96% of white students, all said that they either wanted to go to college, or that whatever career that they were choosing would require some post-secondary work. So they could want to be a welder or a plumber. Yes, you're going to have to graduate from high school, and you're going to need some trade school, or you're going to need a 2-year college, or you're going to need a 4-year college or university. And so this idea that some kind of way it is okay for us to leave students behind, and that does not contribute to the school to prison pipeline is a fallacy. Like, we know that, one, students know exactly what they want to do, and we know that that most of the time it's going to take some kind of post-secondary work. And so I just want to stop there, because that is the framing for how we get into, so what do we do? What do we need to do if we know that our students, you know, once we figured out school discipline, once we've, you know, decided how we're going to, you know, live with justice inside of schools, we are not pushing kids out of school because of their discipline, because of bad discipline policies, but they are in school. We've got to fix schools. And so this panel is, you know, chomping at the bit to talk about how do we fix schools so those 96% of students can live, not only to survive elementary, middle, and high school, not just survive it, but to thrive and to meet their fullest potential. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Rabbi Lydia.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much, Deirdre, for that incredible framing of what we're going to be doing tonight. My name is Rabbi Lydia Medwin. I serve at the Temple here in Atlanta, Georgia. And the Temple is one of the 3 core partners of the Ending Mass Incarceration multi-faith initiative to end mass incarceration. And we're delighted, we're just thrilled to be able to have this panel tonight, because our panelists are so just exceptional. I'm going to do a quick introduction of everybody all at once. And then I want to get down to some questions with y'all. So just to let folks know who's on the screen tonight, we have Willie Francois, who is the chair of the Black Church Center for Justice and Equity, as well as the senior pastor of Mount Zion Baptist Church of Pleasantville. He is an expert in liberation theology. He studied at Morehouse and Emory here in Atlanta. And he is the author of the Christian Minister's Manual for Public Pulpit Service, and also the Public Square. We're so delighted to have you with us. We also have Kenya Bradshaw here tonight. She has been a strategy expert at TNTP. She currently serves as the Community Building Advisor for Reconstruction. She has served as the Executive Director in Tennessee for Stand for Children, which and has done amazing work for child advocacy there, creating tools that help governments really figure out how education is impacting students and can do so in the best way possible. And then we also have Robert Harvey. Dr. Harvey is the Superintendent for East Harlem Scholars Academics. He is the author of the newly published, but relatively newly published book, Abolitionist Leadership in Schools. And he is the visiting professor of practice of public leadership, Memphis Theological Seminary, where he also got his doctorate and master's at Harvard. I hope I got all that right, y'all. I feel so honored to be able to facilitate this conversation tonight and really just learn from all of you. So here's our first question for you. Also from Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where we learn education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity, or it becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world. So we learn education can be a form of liberation and an alternative to the school to prison pipelines. So I'd like to invite all of you to reflect for a few minutes to talk a little bit about what does good education look like? How would you define education? Is that different from good education? Maybe it's the same. We're going to hear from Reverend Francois, and then Ms. Bradshaw, and then Dr. Harvey.
Thank you so much, Rabbi, for convening us tonight, and thank you to the entire EMI community for this opportunity to chat. As the one who is not formally has not been formally in education, I'll acknowledge that I think that it's important to say that education is a human right to personal and social transformation that honors and expands the birthright gifts of children and all people, right? And I think that there has to be a heavy emphasis on the birthright gifts of those who are being educated, that honors the fact that there must be radical mutuality in the entire process. One of the dangers of education practices is when you have the kind of banking model that Freire rejects, the kind of apprentice model, the apprenticeship models that don't honor the inherent, the birthright gifts, what Deirdre called the brilliance, the organic brilliance of children. And so education has to serve as a practice of liberation, as a tool of liberation, and not as a tool of social condemnation. And so often what we've seen is that our schools and educational processes have condemned more lives than it has liberated. And I guess we can say that there is too much schooling that we see that forms subjects to occupy these prescribed places in society, and not enough education that actually shapes subjects to raise questions and create in ways that are anti-imperialist and anti-hegemonic. And I say that to say that I've come to this conclusion, and maybe I'm late at this, but schools and prisons aren't the problem. America's actually the problem. And the role of education has to be the dismantling and reconstruction of America itself. Just thinking here very locally, thinking here very, very nationally. Like, schools and prisons aren't the problem. Those are symptoms of the problem, of the white problem of America. And education as a human right has to be this work of personal transformation that leads to the dismantling of these imperialist hegemonic structures that ultimately give way to the rebuilding of something else. I think that's why the three of us, as we're having this conversation, we ground our activism, we ground our professional work, we ground our engagement in abolitionism. As a pastor, I engage my work in what I call abolitionist spirituality, a sacred intolerance to inequity, a sacred, an active and urgent dismantling of those structures, a commitment to repairing the harm to bodies and minds, and then a reconstruction of something that is sustainable, of something that honors the inherent dignity and birthright gifts of our person. So if nothing else, that prisons and schools are not the problem, America is, and we have a role to detangle schools from the capitalist extraction that's really destroying all of us.
Thank you so much. Yes.
Dr. Francois' piece around the system being fundamentally flawed is correct. I think that as a society and as a people, though, we have to reclaim the truth and our passion around education. When you think about post-slavery and one-room schoolhouses, I have a picture of it in my office to consistently remind me of the importance of education to our people. What I believe has taken place is that we have abdicated the responsibility for educating our children to an institution and not really recognize that true education has to be done by every institution in our community. And if we were to reclaim that, I believe that many of the values around freedom, around questioning, around recreating a system and a society can be done. But if we continue to believe that an institution that is fundamentally flawed, that is based upon outcomes of test scores rather than outcomes of life for our children, we will continue to get the same result. And so I actually think that in addition to reconstructing the system, we have to reconstruct who are the players in that system as well. And so for education to really live into its true state of freedom, I'll end where Dr. Francois ended. We have to think about how we are reclaiming our authority role and reconstructing what happens in education going forward. For me, that is true education and true liberation. And for a student, what that looks like is I have the ability to be able to determine my life trajectory. And if the current institutions that are in our community are not giving our children that flexibility and the ability to be able to do that, it in of itself is broken.
Yeah, so I second both of my colleagues tremendously. Something that jumps out of me in this conversation is Dr. Francois introduced the idea of abolition, and then Kenya followed up with Reconstruction, which is a progeny of the abolitionist movement. I'm thinking about national Reconstruction, right? And so, for me, when I think about the point of education, I want to make two claims. One, I make a fundamental claim that the role of education must be abolitionist, which I define as being passionately human, radically moral, and no less divine, right? Like, it has to be these three truths. And by human, it's not just human, it's human and humane. So we don't have a passionately human and humane, a radically moral, and a no less divine starting point. That, to me, we've already missed the point of education, particularly with Freire in our backdrop. This is where I depart from a lot of my colleagues in the space. How that lives needs to look fundamentally different for white folks and for folks of color. And I make that I am good with making that claim. I believe what we have done in the school reform world is, one, we use the word reform, problem. Secondly, we have tried to cast a vision of praxis that is the same for the little white child as it is for the Black and brown child. And that is a flawed starting point. Because for me, what the white child needs is relative to what Dr. Francois lifted up, right? Which is this kind of dismantling and deconstruction of what whiteness has done to democracy. And then that white child situating how their whiteness is complicit with the perpetuation of of democracy, unless they change it. But where the Black and brown child needs, I think Kenya lifts up, which is a reclamation of a communal consciousness, right? So I am deeply driven by the fact that where integration took us down the wrong journey is that integration took us into like the capitalistic version of an I consciousness and an individualism that was not a part of that one room schoolhouse. That one room schoolhouse that Kenya talks about was a we consciousness, where when I entered the threshold, right? When I entered that room, I entered that room about advancing the needs of everybody in that space with me so that all of Blackness could rise together. What we have done now is we have pitted oppressed people against oppressed people within education by centering an I consciousness. And I consciousness work is a product of whiteness. So for me, education is, and I'll frame it here, passionately human, radically moral, but no less divine work, where we guide Black and brown students to a rediscovery of we consciousness, and we help white children dismantle the I consciousness, self-centeredness of what it means to be American democracy. So that is my starting point in this conversation. And if we start there, then we can see where democracy takes us.
Woo! Thank you. Amen to everything y'all said. And I see reflections of all the things that you said, both in my own experience as a child. I've reflected with a couple of our panelists who spent some time in Memphis, Tennessee, where I grew up and received a education that was very clearly, in hindsight, one deeply ingrained in race and racism. And I dream about the kinds of worlds that you have just painted. The world that as it should be, versus the world as it is, which I think all of you have also touched on in terms of like, well, what do we do about this, And so all of this, the world as it is, we're rooted in education, whether we are building towards the world that we really need to be living in or not, we are all exposed to what it means to be in education. We're all still a part. We can't just stop the train, right? We're still on it as we're moving forward. And we know that being a part of the system continues to, for better and for worse, lead to economic mobility and being in relationship with the student to prison pipeline. We want to, of course, see that education actually creates humans who can live and thrive in our current community and society, even as the train continues on towards perfecting. And so how do we get kids prepared to access college and career? even with all of the challenges that you've all stated, you know, or maybe despite, and maybe because of, how do we actually get kids prepared to access college and career? Dr. Harvey, will you respond first? Then we'll hear from Dr. Francois and Ms. Bradshaw.
Sure. So I'll respond in 2, maybe 3 ways. My opening is I wrestle with the question being the wrong question. That's my that's my transparency, right? I am not sure the idea of getting, I am not sure it is the idea of getting kids ready for college and career as much as it is getting young people ready to be the best young people in the world. And I think that claim is very, very different, because I think about our work, when we talk about getting kids ready for college and career, what we tend to do is we tend to drift into the percentages and the data points that indicate that a young person is ready. But what that does is it assumes that the guiding metrics of readiness have already qualified for racism, have already qualified for a dirty version of capitalism, have already qualified for a politic where they are not on the ballot, right? So for us, it is versus starting there. What are the habits of mind and praxis that make you a passionately human, radically moral, no less divine, right? That same principle of abolition. What makes you that? And so what we are thinking about in our organization and our network of schools is, who is that child? That child can navigate anything in the world. So I'll tell you, one of the ways you get a child ready to be that is you engage a child in questions around democracy from the moment they enter the pipeline of schooling, right? Dr. Francois knows as well, our young people from pre-K, 4 years old, UPK in New York City, through our high school, all know the word democracy. You cannot escape it in our network of schools. Imagine what it means for a 4-year-old to be able to say, what is democracy? People having rights. That's enough of a starting point for a 4-year-old for me. That seed is the beginning of that young person being able to be college and career ready, because that seed has that 4-year-old already thinking about questions of what does it mean to be a human navigating the place I'm being sent out to? What does that look like in high school? Dr. Francois and I co-taught a class this year around the history of debates, arguments, and race in this country, right? So you prepare a child for the world by having that conversation. I'm in 9th grade wrestling with what is the role of Blackness and shaping the queer movement of Stonewall. And that was literally a conversation we had. That young person can go out into the world. They can choose college, they can choose career, they can choose to sit at home for all I care. But what they will be is an effective democratic citizen, because they have wrestled with the concepts of that communal consciousness of how do I participate in the communality of building this nation. So for me, it is that is the starting point of how are we clear that we are trying to shape young people who have a communality about democracy in the world, A, and then B, and I'll end here, and I'm going back to Freire. Freire says that the point of schooling to be ready in the world is to make you conscious, conscientization, right? If you are conscious about the way the world works, you can nuance between whether it's college, whether it's a gap year, whether it's a career, whether it's a trade, whether it's a micro credential, whether you're going to take over a business, whether you're going to be an entrepreneur. Because your conscientization about the world is that I know enough about how it works to be able to utilize my agency to move effectively in the world how I choose at any given moment. And so what we tell young people is, we don't need you to actually pick either. We need you to be conscious enough to know how they all work, so that when you do get ready to pick a pathway, A, you know it's not linear, B, you know it's not fixed forever, and C, you also know that you are the author of it. So if you decide midway through you're changing course, you are conscious enough to know what comes along with changing course. You are conscious enough to know the risk of changing course. You are conscious enough to determine, if I change course, what are the consequences to my community that might be relying on me? So I am more concerned with building that young person and then sending them out to figure out whether or not they're college ready, career ready, whatever ready, because we've done our part to shape who they need to be in the world. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I have a particular appreciation for Dr. Harvey's departure from the question, his problematizing of the question in many ways, because I think in some ways the college or career question is still the idea of making workers, and what does it mean? And that just adds people to the capitalist extraction that is happening in our communities. I think there's more so like, how does the role of education help us think about personal flourishing? How does it help us gain a kind of abundant humanity that is other-centered? And also, what does it mean? Dr. Harvey talked about this. He and I talked about this a lot. And it's not just democratic participation, but what does it mean to have democratic power, right? That the educational process is doing possibly those three things. But I also want to say, like, some ways of getting that has to be like the abolition of apartheid schools and prison schools, right? There has to be this abolition of these school structures that discipline the body well before you're ever suspended, whether it's out of school suspension or in school suspension. Students' bodies are disciplined by the curriculum. Students' bodies are disciplined by the architecture of schools. To walk through a metal detector every day, it disciplines me, to use Foucault's language. It shapes how I understand myself, and it communicates to me something that's at work beneath the conscious, that you never have to call me the N-word. You never have to talk about my alleged place of origin because being inferior, because there's something about my context and my environment that has disciplined me to believe in my own inferiority, right? So there has to be, how are we abolishing apartheid schools and prison schools that are actually disciplining the minds and the bodies of students, whether or not they are kicked out of school or whether or not they're in the classroom learning, as we would say. So I think that's a big part of it. There are 14 million students who are in schools that have abundant police forces, but no counselors, no nurses, no psychologists, no social workers. What does that communicate to folks? People are in schools where there's middle class and white flight happening, right? It's just happening. What does it mean when I'm the left behind? What is it communicated to me that I am stuck in a prison or an apartheid school and I can't get out? The conversation about getting out is not even being had on my behalf. Like, these are, like, there has to be, and we can talk about how we get there, but we have to talk about the other ways, the other types of violences, the discursive violences that are being committed against Black and brown students that are foreclosing opportunities for flourishing, that are foreclosing opportunities for democratic power, that are foreclosing opportunities for what it means to gain to have an abundant humanity that is other-centered. And I think that when I'm talking about, and maybe we don't talk about this as a school to prison pipeline, maybe as Carla Shedd talks about this, maybe we should be talking about this as a carceral continuum, because the spirit of punishment is in all these institutions, right? It's in our social safety net, alleged social safety net. It's in our democratic process. It's in our schools. It's in our financial systems. It's in our residential neighborhoods. Like, the idea of the carcerality of America is embedded. The spirit of punishment is embedded in all that we engage and see. And so we have to see the dismantling of carcerality as we can start with the schools, but we know that it's in all of what we're engaging and what we're seeing. And I think the last point I would want to make is, and just connected to this, is that there has to be persons in the classroom and in the hallways who don't map narratives of pathologies and criminalization on children's bodies, right? These are fundamental ways that we can cut the kind of discursive discipline that is communicating narratives of inferiority and narratives of alienation onto children.
One of my personal values is to walk in a place of truth and love. And in that, I believe if we started in our educational system around that, we could end in a different place, because we are lying to our children and we are lying to their families around what our current educational system is going to prepare them for. And our data shows that what I'm saying is true. So even our students who are graduating from the current system are going into college and 60% of them are having to take remedial courses, which in itself is fraud. Because if I have to take over what I have already taken, it means that I did not get a foundational knowledge in the institution that prior to going into college. And so if we start from that place and then think about how are we reworking the system, so it is not just building workers, because much of our educational institutions now, especially in communities of color, are building workers. And the reason I say that is because we know what different looks like. So if you go to Andover or you go to Exeter and then you go to South Memphis, the way even school is structured, the experience that students are having in a day, the critical conversations that they are engaging in are different. So we are doing rote memorization in many of our traditional public schools. When we are doing critical thinking, we are exposing them to complex text. We are doing all of the things that we say, like, hey, you actually have to have them with high quality content material. We do that in some places. In some places, we have decided that children who come from these zip codes across America are not only capable, they are not worthy of being able to have access to that. So we have to fundamentally deconstruct that system as one piece. The other is where I still feel like we are lying to communities is what we say the culmination of that experience means. And so when you look at assessment of our children across America, even if your student passes your state assessment, in most cases, that is saying at the highest level, your student is doing ninth grade work. Why are we comfortable with students who have spent 3 additional years who are in 12th grade saying that we are just assessing to ensure that you are at least at this level? That is a fundamental problem that we have to begin to question. And that is really the role of where we're pushing each of us and our organizations to say, what is the truth of the education that you are ascribing to our children? Where are you saying that they are going to go post this, and how are we looking at that? The other thing that I would say is look at your community as it is right now. So Lydia talked about Memphis. So we have one of the highest disengaged youth between the ages of 16 and 25, which means our young men and young women who are graduating from our school are neither working nor in school nor in college, and at the highest rate in the country. If that is the reality, if this was any other industry, we would then question what is the input that the industry is doing to get this output. And so how do we begin to really reflect on that, not asking that we forego another generation, that we look at the generations that this institution has already produced.
So Kenya, if I can hop in here for a second, just one more thing. So Kenya lifted up something that I think is so powerful about that last point around looking at who we've already put out into the world and what does that already say? And it's bringing me back to this idea of Reconstruction. Now she has my head swim with Reconstruction, of like, let's not forget, and Dr. Francois, listen to this, right? That the first product of Reconstruction were the Black codes and the vagrancy laws, right? This was the first product of Reconstruction. Black code said all freedmen, all Negroes, all mulattoes above the age of 18 need to have a job or need to be back to their owner. If not, they will be fined, killed, murdered, or in prison, right? The original career readiness pipeline was the black codes of Reconstruction in 1865. That was the initial college readiness pipeline, which is why I'm so anti that language, because we had laws in place that said you got to pick a pathway to participate in the production of white capitalism by the time you turn 18. And if you don't, vagrancy laws said you had 30 days to have a plan to be a this or to be a that, or you were sent back to chattel slavery. That is what, and that's why I tell our team, that career college ready language We don't do that. That is a reincarnation in 2021 of the Black Code and the vagrancy laws that Lincoln left in place a year before his demise. And so when we use that language, we are literally perpetuating the new 200-year version of Reconstruction. And I'm pretty sure that's not the standard we're trying to carry when we talk about a prison school pipeline. Because if you want to see prison school pipeline example, boom, there it is. That kids have to pick, and if they don't pick, we're going to pick for them. And we typically pick jail, unemployment, economic strife, generational poverty. We do disinvestment in North Memphis and Raleigh, Fraser, right? Like, we pick. If you don't pick by 18, we pick for you in this country. So that is another reason why I reject that framing, because we've done that since 1866.
I'm so deeply grateful for all of your contributions up to now, really, really talking about not just the problems that we're encountering, the deep systemic, historical, racist issues that the school systems have been built on, but also proposing some incredibly beautiful, radical shifts for where we could be going, right? What this could actually look like when we honor one another's God-given humanity, the divinity in all of us. One of my favorite teachers always teaches that the folks inside of the system will never be the ones that change the system, right? There are too many people benefiting from the system the way it is. Some of the colleagues from TNTP have raised the research that has been done recently about what it looks like to have Black teachers inside of schools, and the ways in which Black students are more likely to enroll in college. You know, having one Black teacher for Black students is 13% more likely to enroll in college. 2 Black teachers means the number jumps to 32% more likely. Having a Black teacher also cuts dropout rates dramatically for Black students. And one reason is, according to the research, the importance of teacher relationships, and especially those who have high expectations. So for instance, when surveyed, nearly twice as many teachers who shared their students' ethnicities had higher expectations for their students, 66% compared to 35%. So as important as this is, you know, some students will still never see a teacher like them in the front of the classroom. Can you speak to the roles that teachers of color play? Why is it important? Do you think it's important? And what else do we need to know about this issue? Ms. Bradshaw Adjukum. Did I say it correctly? I'm sorry.
Oh, you're fine. It's like adjective, but it's adjukum.
Adjukum.
So that's the easiest way to say it. So I think that we know. So one of the most powerful podcasts that I've listened to in the last few years has been Malcolm Gladwell's Revisionist History and the piece on Brown versus Board of Education. If you hadn't heard it, I highly recommend it. And one of the reasons around it is because it reframed for me the deficit narrative that we had been taught around Brown versus Board. So when I was in school, I was taught that because Black people had inferior schools, that's why we wanted to have integration of schools. In reality, when you listen to Ms. Brown, she talked about proximity. She was like, actually, the reason that my family fought for this school, because there was a white school right across the street from me, and I had to go to another school that was a few miles away. So it really was about convenience. But the judge in the case had to paint a narrative around the deficit nature around a student being exposed to Black teachers, that they should have proximity to whiteness. So that is what the language was included in the case, the final ruling. So we were always taught that it was because we had these bad Black teachers. That case in itself has impacted who has been teaching in our classrooms since then. Prior to that, when you were in schools and communities, the people who came back from Harvard, Yale, Fisk, Morehouse, they were coming back into roles. So you had people who had physics degrees coming into our high schools teaching physics. And so you were getting the best and the brightest already in your community. And that made you be able to see, I have the ability to be able to achieve that because I am seeing it in front of me. When you don't have that, it actually plays a role in your ability to imagine what you're going to be able to accomplish. So that's just from a framing and imagination standpoint. We could then go into what do we know about the data of all children benefit from being in front of teachers of color. So let's start there. So it is not just African American students who are going to benefit from having an African American teacher. The level of consciousness that that teacher brings into the classroom, having been a person of color, increases their ability to be able to see that student as being successful. There's a new report out today where they just did, it came out yesterday, that talked about just the grading of teachers. And so if a teacher saw a writing sample with the name of Deshaun on it or the name of Caleb on the front, that the Deshaun writing sample by white teachers got a lower score, even though it was the exact same text. They then went on to say, we then tested them for explicit bias. And what we saw, we couldn't say that you were just racist and that made you do it. There is some implicit bias that we are seeing in like the familiarity of teachers that is causing them to then do harm to our children. We can say that we know that students who are exposed to teachers of color have higher academic performance. We have data around them having improved math and reading skills. Kids are going to have stronger reading when they are exposed to that. But 80% of our students may never have that in a day. So we actually have to fundamentally change that. And also, I think that it is important in your psychological growth, whether you are African American, you are Latino, you are Asian American, that you get access to a teacher who looks like you, and the teachers who teach in your community should mirror that community. So when you look at data around Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, majority of the teachers across that state are white women. That does not match with who is in those communities, in those public education systems. So for me, this is not a fundamental displacement around white teachers. So I want to be clear, but I know we are growing as a society. It is just a meaning around how are we intentional in our hiring practices to make sure that those people that come into our system are more reflective of the communities that we have the privilege of serving. And we have to be intentional about that work. If you just say, hey, this is something of value, and you don't do the work around it, it won't ever happen. And so how are we as a society really saying this is core to our fundamental educational thrust that we want to obtain for our children, is ensuring that they are getting exposure to teachers of color in their classrooms every day.
Thank you. Dr. Francois, do you want to reflect on that next? And then Dr. Harvey.
Yeah, I just wanted to, what I intended to say is that, white students need Black teachers because of how that impacts formation, how that impacts the way they will be able to show up in democratic and social society. And I think there's no question about whether or not there's a deep impact of being able to see someone that looks like you in that kind of compassionate authority that teachers often that educators carry. And so we know there are no questions around that, but there has to also be, and I think this deserves to be nuanced, is that we should not assume that whiteness does not inhabit non-white bodies. I want to be clear about that. As much as I know for sure that we need Black teachers in front of American classrooms, is that there must be work done to exercise, to use some theological language, to exercise the demon of white supremacy, that the spirit of white supremacy and punishment that exists in our schools, that exists in all American institutions. which is why, I mean, we think there's a need for federal and state legislation that incentivizes diversifying education professionals. It's just really important, and we need to. And when we talk about this legislation, the government has a responsibility not just to incentivize it, but making sure that it is a livable wage. And I think that is one of the dangers to our educators, is that it is not always a livable wage. You know, Dr. Harvey lives in one of the most expensive cities in the world, and on certain educator salary, it is not easy to be a full-time teacher. And so think about the capacity of teachers who are full-time parents and full-time teachers and still have to get extra jobs in order to meet the rent crisis that exists in New York. Now, Dr. Harvey's district, they pay significantly well, so he doesn't have this crisis where he is. But I know educators who live in New York and can't afford to live in New York. And I think that this country has an obligation to protect teachers and to see teachers as frontline workers of democracy, to see teachers as to see teachers as the first responders of our community, the mental health first responders, the academic first responders. We've seen this so often, that teachers become these catch-all professionals because, particularly Black teachers, the way they are invested in the full lives of their students, right? Is that we have to start, we need to demand federal and state legislation that actually protects the income, protects the wealth, that allows teachers to grow and build wealth. And that's not something we often say about teachers. We talk about teachers having income, but what does it mean to honor the educator so much so that you say, as an educator, you can build wealth? That is all I could add to that.
So I want to begin where both of my friends ended, and then arc back to the first question around high expectations, or how you frame the question. So both Kenya and Willie framed phenomenally why we need them. My push here for us, though, is, as we know, the research says that white children and all children benefit from teachers of color. Dr. Francois lifted up something that I think we don't say enough, because Black folks, Black and brown folks, through our communal consciousness, are inherently often pro all children. Let's be clear, right? All children tend to benefit from teachers of color because teachers of color are pro all children, which is not a claim we can make about all white teachers, right? We cannot suggest is that I versus we consciousness. So I said that. But my problem with that, my push with that, and I tell our staff all the time, what we are then saying is, and we are okay with Black people carrying the load of educating white children from whiteness. And that is a problem, right? Because so we know that white children and white communities benefit from teachers of color, and what we don't do is control for what Education Trust and John King calls the invisible tax, right? John King talks about this invisible tax that Black and brown people pay who are educators. What's one version of that tax? One tax is, I got to deal with my own racial trauma. I have to hold my Black and brown kids tight, and I have to help a white person realize that they're white at the same time. Like, hell, that's a lot of work to do in one context, but we make Black and brown educators pay that tax regularly because we say, well, all kids benefit. Sure. So what I propose is, and what we do in our network, and Willie knows this, for our Black educators who we know have what we call the double lift or the invisible tax, we don't just suggest, we require a form of regular monthly therapy that we pay for, because it is a heavy burden to educate Black folks, brown folks, and then white folks on being white. So we tell our educators all the time, particularly our Black and brown, Black female educators, and our Black queer educators, you are required to do therapy on our dime and dollar, because what you are doing is not sustainable, bearing your trauma, their trauma, and white folks' trauma. So I'll say that. I'll end by saying, on the idea of high expectations, we have rejected that language, and we've embraced what Zaretta Hammond calls warm demanding, or a warm demander. High expectations is, again, a capitalist use of almost what you'll notice, right? Almost all of our catchphrases in school reform are forms of capitalism. School to prison pipeline, college career ready, high expectations. These are all forms of production. And I'm spending a lot of time in my life now, particularly with this book, How do we privilege being over doing, being over putting out, being over creating? High expectations automatically assumes I gotta do something. It automatically assumes I gotta produce something. It automatically assumes I have to reach a standard. Warm, demanding culture automatically means I am situated here. I am seen. There is something warm about this space where I am centered first. That's what makes it warm. And then there will be something demanded of me, sure, but only once I feel warm in this space, right? So what is in the warm, demanding culture that is not in the high expectation culture is trust. Before I ask you to do anything, do you trust me? And that's theological. And if I was and the Black church in me wants to preach that right there for like 30 seconds, right? It's like, do you trust me? Because if you don't trust me, I can have a high expectation of you from here to yonder. You will not meet it because you don't trust me. And I have not created a context by which trust can flourish. Warm demanding says I create the context first by which trust can exist. And only once I've created a context by which trust can exist, then trust gives birth to demand, right? I cannot demand anything of anybody who doesn't have trust in me first, right? Because you have to trust that what I am demanding of you is not for me. It is about we. It is about your growth. It is about the collective community growing. So I would propose, once again, I feel like I have the language police tonight. I would propose that we yield our high expectation language at the feet of Zaretta Hammond and embrace a warm demander language as a way to frame being before doing.
So tonight we've heard, I think, some really important reframing and relanguaging. We're so grateful for that. And I kept hearing over and over again words that are so familiar to me: trust, being seen, like truly seen in a sort of, if you're familiar with the Jewish philosopher Buber, who really believes that in an I-thou relationship, and when one really truly sees the other, there's actually a third partner in there, that being the divine, right? Sort of participating in that. I've heard radically divine. I've heard this emphasis on community, on we, and as opposed to the me and I, right? And all of this brings us back to faith. For me, this is very comfortable language, and it lifts up for me what is also true, which is this notion that there's this dichotomy between school versus what happens out in the world, right? That somehow our faith lives are disconnected from what might happen inside of a secular school. And so I guess the last question we want to propose to everybody tonight is, what role do faith leaders play in directly supporting learners and advocating for policy change? And we'll start again with Ms. Bradshaw at Jacob, and then we'll go to Dr. Harvey, and Dr. Francois will close this out for this question.
So you go to the non-preacher about faith. So I don't
know. I heard a
feel
lot of good preaching from you, so let's go.
feel equipped to be able to do that.
Get it.
But
Let's get it.
I will start with two things that I feel like. The two institutions that for me have played a fundamental role in the protection and the advancement of Black people have been the Black church and the court system. And the reason why I say that you needed both to be able to move civil rights. And for me, on the church, as we move towards a separation of church and state, churches in many of our communities forgot the abolitionist structure that Dr. Francois talks about, around how our work was supposed to take care of the least of these in our community. And while many of our churches do amazing jobs of service, what they do not do is step into the power that they have and really demand something different in our communities. And so what I am really proposing is that the church do both. Like, you can continue to support the basic needs and the support, but I also want you to demand more for the people in your communities, and to demand that your communities look like the social justice indicators for what your people should have. So while we talk a lot about the institutions of education, I'm also saying that to Dr. Harvey's piece around capitalism, we cannot have logistical corporations in communities that are killing our people through new slave labor in hubs and then say like because our school system then produces them to go there, that either of those systems are correct. And so we actually have to have the church to take its rightful place in demanding the betterment of society. So when you think about, I as I've said in the beginning, I'm situated in Memphis. The church was the place where unions were doing our boycotts because we had so many people who were working in sanitation that were either not getting paid, were being killed, were not being protected. And that was the place for both strategy, restructuring, and demanding change. And so in addition to those pieces that we need all of our churches in our community, we also need them to take a role in educating our children. And so while we do a great job in vacation Bible study and in Sunday school on grounding them in the word, we also need to ground them in an understanding of who they are and their greatness beyond what we are seeing in the schools. And so as we are approaching this new reimagining of what our education system is seeing and dismantling of that, to Dr. Francois' language around dismantling what the current system is, we actually have to have the church step up even more and actually be one of the vehicles for educating our children and take a more communal approach around their education and their betterment in society. Dr. Francois and Dr. Harvey, come on, bring it home and say what the church.
Listen, no, you listen, we could have an ordination council for you, King. You're right.
Right. I got my
So I'll say this. I want to second, literally second and triple everything Kenya said. Here's what I add to it. Right. I think two things. Jesus, one of the things that Jesus says that always captivates me is the idea of suffer not the little children to come. Right. This very captivating phrase. What is not said, but what is interpreted in that text is that somebody brought them to the temple and then therefore brought them to give him access. That's the parent. I am kind of convinced that the Black church, which I'm a part of and a product of and a believer in, has not used its power to galvanize or to educate the Black parent or the Black caregiver around their power in moving outcomes. Nothing can get canceled on my schedule as a superintendent faster than a parent who needs to talk, because that is where the power lives in our context, because that parent tells another parent that this school is not great, this network, this district is not great, and they're moving. And I would love to see what it looks like for us to imagine as the Black church and as the faith community, how do we use our space, because and Deirdre says all the time, we love direct service. How do we use our space, our physical capacity? How do we use our galvanizing opportunities, Sunday school, Bible studies, morning worship? How do we use our resources, literal and human, in order to build ethers where parents are learning of their power, of their significance, of their authority, and then are being trained and developed on how to use that at the most micro level? How do you write an email to your superintendent saying what you have a problem with? How do you formulate an email to a principal that's actually gonna get that principal to listen to you? Because there are strategies to these things, right? Right. You just can't go up in that school talking about my teacher's not great, my child's teacher's unfair. How do we help parents ground that critique, which might be a real critique, ground that critique in a structure where they know where they will be heard? I think that's A. B, I would also contend that our preaching has failed as a form of power in moving the needle in education policy. Dr. Francois, you can cut your screen off because you do this every week. But one of the needle moving realities of the Black church is still the pulpit. Unlike any other denominational or religious context, when pastor speaks, the ark of God moves. And yet most of our pastors don't say a word about education and policy, which means it's incumbent on folks like us to educate them and get them ready. And I celebrate orgs to do that work, like Faith Acts for Education and Black Church Center, who really get pastors up to speed. But pastors have to also be willing to wade into the waters of spaces in which they are not always familiar and just say truths that they can hold true, which is kids matter. Good schools matter. You don't have to be a theologian, nor do you have to be a pedagogue to say that good schools matter. And somebody in that pew who has access to somebody in a boardroom, who has access to somebody on the board of education, who has access to somebody in the mayor's office, who has access to somebody in the state's office, see where this is going, heard that schools matter. Heard the pastor say we need to change assessments. Heard the pastor say that God is not pleased with the way we read in data. Heard the pastor say that God wants us to think about new ways to care for teachers. That's all pastors have to say, and the needle will move. And yet we don't use that kind of hermeneutical power in order to galvanize education access. So that's where I'll end it, and I will yield to he who is the great, the Reverend Dr. Willie Dwayne Francois III.
Goodness. Yeah, I mean, I really don't have anything to say after listening to these brilliant.
Please, please.
But you know, here's what I know. I know that our first. The first education spaces, right? Corporate education spaces that we can point to. Some of the first education spaces that we can point to were Black churches, right? We know that the legacy, that the Black churches were the womb of our schools, the womb of our economy, the womb of the Black business structure, right? And I think that is a legacy, as Kenya mentioned, like that is the abolitionist, Reconstructionist legacy that Black churches must regain. So, I mean, the three of us are Black church folks, so forgive us for the kind of parochial mentioning there, but I think this is true for all faith traditions that want to live out an abolitionist spirituality. Is to honor, it's this reclamation of an abolitionist tradition, a reclamation of Brush Harbor spirituality, and not the kind of plantation religion that allies us with power and allies us with politics and allies us with the systems and the structures. So there has to be something in our faith communities that actually wants to reach toward the Brush Harbor and not the plantation. All right, and there are multiple ways of seeing how that cashes out, but the way I'm thinking about this, and I talk to Deirdre about this often, is that Black churches, all faith community, all faith centers have to figure out what does it mean to be the Underground Railroad, right? That this direct service work happens, that we are directly impacting the academic process in some ways, right? So whether we are turning our Sabbath schools, our Sunday schools into literacy hubs, right? Is that, yeah, we're using the word as a way of increasing literacy, right? That is a way of us thinking about ourselves as the Underground Railroad, that we know that there is a system where our folk are falling out of the bottom, right? But we as faith folk are in this organized conspiracy of runoffs, right? We're running people off these plantations, even if it's just for a couple of hours at the end of the day. We're running them off the plantation into real incubators of literacy and learning and STEM or whatever that is, and we send them back, different than the way they came each time, this sort of Underground Railroad approach. But they're also, churches need an advocacy strategy. And part of that is connected to how my colleagues have talked about activating parent and student activists, right? Because one of the dangers of any education movement, of any movement, particularly this ed revitalization movement, is when we don't center the voices of impacted people, right? We don't know how to be allies in the right way when we suck up all the air in the room and we center our voices and center our will, and we do not center the impacted voices of parents and of students. And I think an advocacy strategy of faith communities has to figure out how do we center those voices, center those stories, but also mobilize them in building power themselves. One of the things that we've been able to do here in South Jersey through our church is to build a multiracial movement to end apartheid in our schools here, to end the concentrated powerlessness in the schools in New Jersey. And it is a coalition of labor. It's a code of the labor unions, a part of this movement. Educators are a part of this movement. Parents are a part of this movement. Students are a part of this movement. But there has the faith community is a part of this movement. But centering the voices of the impacted persons is really important for how we do that. Right, ending school secession. Right, the secessionist movement that's happening in our schools is really important. And the last thing I want to say, and I know I'm taking too long on this, is that there has to be some internal work that churches do. I'm going to speak very parochially about churches. There has to be the internal work that churches do, because it's impossible to build equity out there if we haven't started building equity in our pews, right? And part of what's going to dismantle the carceral continuum, the prison, the school to prison pipeline, is that we really have to upgrade our theology. We have to abolish the theological terror that aids the criminalization of students in our schools. And how do we do that? Here's some ways we do it. One, we have to really check this doctrine of original sin. Because I think the doctrine of original sin that says all humans are born sinners because of what Adam and Eve did, that is called mass condemnation, and that is no different than mass criminalization and mass incarceration. To say that an entire group of people bear the reputation of one person is the exact same racist logic that makes mass criminalization possible, right? We have to have some conversations about substitutionary atonement theories. Jesus, innocent Jesus, died for our sins. Is it really okay that innocent people are forced to disappear or forced to be removed in order to save the whole? We have to have some questions about what does it mean that the disappearance of Black and brown children is really working toward the salvation of white folk. We got to have some questions around how our theologies are aiding and abetting the logic of racism that is ruining our schools. We got to have some conversations about the spirit of punishment and otherness, sending people to hell because they are different, sending people to hell because of infractions. That is embedded in how we discipline in schools. And finally, we got to have some questions around privatized piety. Faith cannot be about me getting into heaven. Faith has to be about how do we end the institutional iniquities and the systemic sins that are making us live in hell while we are alive.
Amen. You know, I am not saying that I'm gonna become no longer a rabbi, but I am saying that I'm coming to your church. Thank you so much. And, you know, I'll just wrap up and I hand this over to Deirdre in a second, but I just want to reflect on a memory I have from my high school in Memphis, Tennessee, White Station. Yes, it was called White Station High School. And my memory of the lunchroom there, where, and it hurts me to say this today, but you could draw a straight line through the middle of that high school cafeteria. And on one side was all the white kids, and on the other side was all the Black kids. And outside stood the one interracial couple that I knew of at our school, because there was literally no place inside that room for them. And that's the kind of thing that we learned in school. That is where I learned, that's where I primarily learned about my whiteness and what that meant for me, and what Blackness means for me too. Thank God I've had a chance to run into lots of folks who are teaching me, and thank God we've been able to have this conversation, which lifts up the ways in which we are not powerless against this, the outcomes that we see for children and students today in schools. That we have as people of faith, people power, pastor power, organizing power, moral power, imagination power, theological power. The word is power. And so we are so grateful that you shared your thoughts and your expertise with us tonight. I'm gonna hand it over to Deirdre to take us home.
thank you all so much for your work and your words. I am so the I don't even know how to start this. I'm going to start with Robert S. Harvey and all of his reproof and correction. I feel like that is or look at him laughing. But no, for real, that is one of the things that I really do like about organization and movement building, because institutions institutionalize a thing, and then when someone challenges it, then we condemn that person and then try to figure out like how to demonize what they have said. Organization is living and it's moving and it's breathing. It is literally prophetic, and if we lean into it, we can not only like it just has that ability to renew the mind. It's the renewal of the mind. And so like I just thank you, Dr. Harvey, for helping us with the renewal of our mind, for helping us to look at the ways in which the construct of capitalism even lives and embeds in our best thinking about like what does it mean for students to survive, not only survive, but to thrive in communities, right? And so we will be working to correct that. We will be working to correct that both in our toolkit and as we start to prepare faith leaders to have these conversations, both in our, we have a construct at EMI. It's called Preach, Teach, Act. And so when we have these kinds of conversations, we want to give preaching talking points, teaching talking points, and then action talking points. And so we will be working on that so that our Preach, Teach, Act is in aligned with our new language and our new paradigm shift that we got from this conversation. I want to thank the panelists. Their information, not their personal phone numbers. You're not going to be able to text message them, but their information will be a part of our toolkit if you need to get in contact with them, or if you, if you just want to follow their work, you'll be able to do that through the toolkit and being able to, and just the information about them in the toolkit. Next slide. So under that Preach, Teach, Act, and going back full circle to like how we started this work, there's a way in which folks can have amazing panels and become consumers. So you consume the information, makes you feel good, you feel like you've learned something, and then you go away and there's nothing else that happens from that. We did not want these conversations to be consumable, just for consumers, that you just come and consume them, but we wanted to ensure that we were giving opportunities for you to take action. This is not a think tank, this is a think and action tank. So by tomorrow, we will be sending around a toolkit that will help your congregation or your faith institution to really start to delve into how you want to how to grapple with what you've heard today, and then how do you want to show up differently in the world because of this. Like, this should be a change moment. And so I started off this conversation with this idea that we will see you throughout this month, to help you in workshops in May to operationalize this work, but really wanted to lean into that last question that Rabbi Lydia gave to our panelists, which was, what can faith leaders do, right? And so inside of the toolkit, we have we just have some good information about direct service things that you can do. So Dr. Francois talked about, how are we centering impacted people in the ways in which we want to talk about and work on the issue of education. In this toolkit, you'll see plenty of direct service things that you can do, from, adopting a school, having participatory research where, to Dr. Harvey's point, how are you talking to your congregation about the issue of education, and really surveying your congregation or your faith institution so you can understand what's happening in real time in your area. So all of that is in the toolkit. And then on the policy and advocacy side, like once you've decided to, take your faith and put it into action beyond direct service, we also have some sample legislation and some federal legislation that is hot right now that you and your faith institution might want to lend your name and your signature to. And so check that out in the toolkit. Again, last slide, we definitely want to stay in contact with you. Everyone has talked about, you know, centering the voices of impacted people. This idea that we want to hear from those who have been impacted is not just from a congregational or a faith institution level, but it is also that EMI wants to hear from folks. And so we have, again, this text link. So you can text EMI to 797979. And if there's anybody that you know that wants to talk about these issues, I see some folks, you know, there's our brother Jackson that's in the chat. I hope you've already filled this out, brother Jackson, because I know that you have a lot to say, and I want to, you know, personally invite you to fill it out and get closer to this work, because I saw in the chat how you've got some ideas about how formerly incarcerated folks can be a part of this work that we're doing at the intersection of faith and education. The second piece is EMI has chapters. Figure out which chapter that you want to participate in. We're also doing, again, just reiterating, we're also doing our watch party on April the 18th at 4 Eastern Standard Time. And then finally, we've collected surveys from you all about what date you would want to bring your own team to bear in workshopping these toolkits and just figuring out what exactly you all want to do. And so we will end a little bit early, but end right here. Thank you. We will end right here. I want to thank again our panelists and our moderator so much for just, you know, one, leaning into this question of how do we build pipelines to possibilities, and as we dismantle the school to prison pipeline. And then also for taking us to church, because that is what you all did. You all definitely brought life into this conversation, and we thank you again for that. So with all hearts and minds clear, I don't know, Dr. Francois, will you give us the last, a parting ecumenical benediction, and we will get out of here.
Sure. Sure. Come on, let us center ourselves as we prepare to leave and do the work that our souls must have. What a gift it is to share in this virtual experience, this exchange that has been soul food for so many of us, as we're reminded, if nothing else, that we are not alone. But there is that dynamic union between the divine and the human that reminds us that what we've never seen before in terms of justice is still possible. And so as we log off from this experience, may we ignite a passion for the possible, a belief that what has previously been said to be impossible, the eradication of the sins of white supremacy, the sins of patriarchy, the sins of xenophobia, the sins of Islamophobia, the sins that have deeply stained this nation. We log off knowing that it is possible to create a new America, that it is possible to create a new world, because organized people are stronger than organized evil every day of the week. And so as we log off with joy, we log off with hope, we log off with a renewed strength, we log off with a passion to do what we've never done before, because we have been able to see what we've never seen before. Amen.